Welcome to ApacheCon Asia 2022. I hope you've had a great couple of days. We're on the last day of the conference. My name is Justin Mclean, and I'm going to be talking about the Apache Way, and in particular, learning the Apache Way through the ASF Incubator. Just first off, a little bit about who I am. Some people in this audience would know who I are, but I'm sure some do not. I've been involved with the ASF for about a decade in a number of different roles. I have been on the ASF board. I'm currently the VP of the Apache Incubator, and I mentor a number of projects and help out in the incubator where I can, and a number of other projects as well. If you have been on an incubating project over the last decade or are currently in one, I may have reviewed your release and I may have voted -1 on it. There's a joke that has been going around that you're not a real ASF project unless I have voted -1 on your project. That's only come about because I have reviewed hundreds, if not more than 1,000 releases over the last 10 years. So you can imagine if you review enough things, eventually you are going to vote -1 on something. So just a little bit about the Apache Incubator. The Apache Incubator is the main entry path for projects to enter the ASF. What you may not know is that we generally have discussions about projects before they join the incubator, before they even get to a proposal stage. And a number of those projects don't make it for one reason or another. It's just decided that, by both of us usually, that the project is not going to be a good fit for the ASF. So usually by something comes to proposal stage and gets proposed as an incubating project, it's going to be accepted. So once a project is accepted, they are assigned some mentors, and these mentors help guide the project and teach it how to behave like an ASF project. This is often referred to as the Apache Way, and I'm going to go into a little more detail about that a little later in my slides. So as well as the mentors who help you along the project and there to guide you and to answer your questions, the Incubator Project Management Committee is also involved, and they're involved in voting on your releases, in reviewing your reports, and also in the graduation process as well. So I'm going to go through a little bit of all of these and sort of show, what a typical path of an incubating project may be. It generally takes 1 or 2 years to go through the incubation process. This is not always the case. Some projects take a lot longer, some take 4 or 5, and a few have taken a lot less. So it's really going to depend on the people involved and the mentors that you have about how quick this process can be. So once you've become an incubating project, which is often referred to as a podling, what's your aims? What do you need to do? Well, obviously your ultimate aim is to become a top-level project and graduate. But you need to do a bit before you get to that point. And the two main things that you need to do is to learn the Apache Way, and that is the way that makes Apache projects and what makes them last over time, and also grow the community around your project. And growing the community means getting users interested in it, adding committers and PMC members, and along the way you've got to make releases. The Apache Software Foundation, the whole purpose is a charity that creates software for the public good. So if you're not making releases, I don't know what you're doing here. You need to make releases, you need to understand about ASF policy and guidelines and licensing, and you also need to understand about branding and trademarks and why they are important to the ASF. So if you look up the Apache Way, there are many different versions of it. Interpretations is probably the better way to put it. So here is one that I have, and I've made just a little summary of it, and I'll just go through these values, and you can see that these values are worth having, but it's often hard to given a situation to see how to apply these, and I think that's where a lot of projects have have some problems. They understand the Apache Way and what the values are. They're just not sure how that really works in practice. And I'll try and give some examples where, that works. So, first off, the ASF is a charity. We know that. And it creates software for the public good. So you need to be on board with that. That's pretty straightforward. The second thing is we're pragmatic. And we're pragmatic because of the Apache license. The license is business friendly and can be used by people to create commercial and non-commercial software. We're also about community. So, you need to govern that community via consensus. And you want to have a diverse community as well, for reasons that I'll go into a little later. We have this concept of merit. And you need to be a little careful using this word because in some circles it doesn't have a good connotation. But we need to put it in the ASF context. And it basically comes down to the more you contribute, the more responsibility you will be given. Everything needs to be in the open. So you need to do things on mailing lists, for example. And people may not get why this needs to be done. There's a common theme running through all of these, but I'll just go through them all first before I touch on that. And the last one you'll often see is consensus, is that you need to work together and find a way of resolving disagreements, even if you can't agree with each other and moving forward. Now, a lot of these things here, if you look at the community stuff, if you look at the open stuff, if you look at the merit and the consensus, they're all about making a community that exists around a project for a long time. Take open for a minute. So by having things on the mailing list, it means that a new person to the project can search through that archive. They can see how decisions have been made in the past. That's a great way of onboarding someone. It means that they can feel part of the community. They can also get a feel for the people who are in the community and the norms of how the community operates, without having to go off and read documentation and stuff. So that can be a great thing. The same with diversity and community aspects. So you want to be able to attract people to your community that help your project grow over time. And they may be people who are different to you. They may be people who only work part-time on a project and not paid full-time to work on it. There may be people who have this as their hobby. It may be something they're just interested in, but because of other commitments, their day job doesn't allow open source software and they have family commitments, they can only contribute a little bit to it. But having this diverse bunch of people involved in your project is going to get a diverse set of ideas and will quite often lead your project in directions that are unexpected but help fulfill users' needs. So a lot of these things are about building a community and making that community last over time. So if we just translate that a little bit, and some of this is the same, but some of it is a little different. We have this concept of community over code. And if you think about it, you can have the best code base in the world that, serves a need. But if you don't have a good community around that code base, the project's not going to last. It may last 6 months or something like that. But it's not going to be a welcoming community. You're not going to attract users for, certainly not new contributors to the project. It would be very difficult to do so. So it's much better to have a good community and a bad code base than a bad community and a good code base. If you have a good community, then you can fix things in the code base over time. Things don't have to be perfect. But with a good community around a project, stuff can get done and things can improve over time. I was talking about working in the opening and how that helps onboard new people. It also gives trust to people using the software. They can see that there is a diverse community working on this project. They can see that there's not a single entity or vendor who controls the project. They can see, what things are being discussed and what new features may or may not be added. It is certainly one of our strengths that we do this. So the more you contribute to a project, the more responsibility you're given. And I think when you're starting out, some projects don't get this right. They often set the contribution bar far too high. And they also fail to recognize that contribution doesn't just mean code contribution. Contribution can mean a lot of other things. It can mean fixing up the website. It can mean helping users. It can mean speaking at conferences. It can mean producing documentation. It can mean writing tests. All of these things don't have to be code. So that is often, a lesson that projects learn along the way. You also need to work on building consensus. Building consensus can be hard. It can be difficult. It can take time. But again, it is going to make a community that lasts a longer time than some other forms. We also want communities that are vendor neutral. This means that a business can't suddenly change direction, pull everyone off the project, and the project dies. So having lots of different people involved from different employers and different backgrounds on a project, again, is going to make it last over time. And this again leads into the diversity thing that I've been talking about here. Having that diverse set of contributors to your project mean you're going to get new and interesting ideas. It means that you're not going to get stuck with one way of doing things, and that's great. Sometimes it may take time again to work out what the best way forward is with all these conflicting ideas, but generally that's a good problem to have. These are the things you want to try and aim for. So very early on in the process, you'll work out that licensing and branding is key. All right, we need to establish where the code came from. We want to know where every single line of code came from, really, if we want to get down to that level. And it's really important to manage the ASF and project's brand and trademarks. Some incubating projects leave this to just before graduation, and if you run into some serious problems there, they can be quite hard to correct. So my advice is, look at these early on, ask your mentors for help, and understand what is required there. So the first exposure you'll probably have it to the ASF as part of an incubating project is creating a software grant to actually grant the initial software for the project to get off the ground. And then also any significant contributions, or anyone who's a committer is going to need to sign an ICLA, that's an individual contributor license agreement. And finally, the software that you produce needs to be Apache version 2 license. That's you're an ASF project. That's just a given. So you may need to change some licensing, and you may need to look at whether all your licensing is compatible or not. And we'll go into a little more detail about that in a later slide. So part of the bootstrap process is you've transferred your code to the ASF, usually via a software grant, but it doesn't have to be that way. You've set up the mailing list, version control, website. You've looked into maybe using GitHub issues or Jira. You may have set up some CI with build boxes, and you've got the Podling Project Management Committee set up, and things are getting off the ground. This is usually a fairly straightforward process. Sometimes there can be some delays in setting things up, but generally it runs fairly smoothly. So just a note on, you're making software, you're releasing it under the Apache license version 2. Why do people like the Apache license so much? As a policy at the ASF, you need to use that license. That's sort of not unexpected, but a lot of other people use the Apache license as well. And this is because it's a pragmatic, business-friendly license. You can be seen as the universal donor. Anyone can take some code that is Apache licensed and use it. There's very few restrictions on what you can and can't do with it. It means it can be used for commercial and non-commercial use without any legal risk. And it's also compatible with a wide range of other open source licenses. So this drives adoption of Apache licensed software. When you're looking at making a release, you may have some third-party code in your release, and these can come in, depending on how it's licensed, these can come in three categories. So there's category A, which is permissive licenses such as MIT and BSD, and these can be included in a source release. So basically they don't add any restrictions on top of the Apache license. Then there are category B, which are mostly weak copyleft licenses, and these can be included in a convenience binary release, but not in a source release. And then finally there's category X, which you can't include in a release and can't have as a dependency, and these are things like GPL and LGPL and non-commercial licenses. So you need to sort this all out while you're making your first release. And it may be that it's going to take some time to sort out, and so you can actually use the incubator's alternate disclaimer to tell people that things are not quite correct, but you're working on it. So when you are making a release and distributing it, it's actually an act of the foundation. And that means that the ASF gives you legal protection in making this release. And this is a good thing. This means that you can make some mistakes, and it means that while it's very unlikely that you'll ever be involved in legal action, it means that you'll have some protection there, and the ASF would step up and help you if you were ever put in that position. So when you're making a release, it does need to be approved by the incubator PMC. This is why you're in the incubator. Once you become a top level project, that's no longer a requirement. And so the incubator PMC needs to vote on that release as well as you, and the incubator may find some issues and you may have to create a new release candidate. Once those two votes have passed, then you can distribute the release on the ASF Mirror CDN system, and all is good. So just a little more detail on releases. So releases are voted on. So in the case of an incubator release, as I said, they're voted first on by the project itself and then on the incubator. The releases are signed and can be verified that they are actually the thing that was released. And this is important to some people, not to everyone. There's also needs to be an incubator disclaimer in there. So this is just to tell people that things may not have all been sorted out yet, and there may be some issues with this release, and there may be a higher level of legal risk with it. It needs to have a license and notice file. It needs to follow the Apache license version 2 license terms, and it also needs to follow ASF policy. So sometimes that can be a little hard to work out depending on how complex your release is. But generally this is relatively straightforward. Files in the source release need to have ASF headers. This is because files can sometimes get misplaced or removed from where they originally are from. And that license information may be lost. And finally, the ASF makes source releases. We actually release source, so a source release can't have any compiled code in it. So this is a fairly short list, but it can sometimes take a little while to get right. You can also make convenience binary releases. These are optional and are not official releases, but they also need to follow ASF policy. And because a binary release may contain a lot of things that aren't in a software release, then it may have a different contents into the license and notice file. And this can sometimes trip projects up. But again, ask your mentors for help. That is what they're there for, and they'll be able to offer you, a guidance on this. So when voting on releases, you need to vote on the mailing list, and typically you want this vote to be open for 72 hours. So 72 hours is just a guideline. You can do it differently if you want to, if you have a good reason. But 72 hours allows people in different time zones, people who may have different day jobs or have other commitments, a chance to be voting on the release. Now, a -1 vote on a release is not a veto, but you would consider, if it came with a good reason, you might want to consider not making a release. Technically a release passes when it gets 3 +1 votes and more +1s than -1s, but I would still wait for that 72 hours to go by, rather than, making a release as soon as you get 3+1 votes. So once that passes on your mailing list, then you need another vote on the incubator mailing list. And on this one, only the incubator PMC votes are binding. And quite often, particularly if it's your first release, the incubator may find some issues. And so that vote may not pass. But if both votes pass, you can release it. If one of them fails, then you need to go back and fix that issue and make a new release candidate. So you might have to do this a couple of times. But generally, it's a fairly painless process. So -1 votes do occasionally occur. I would guess in probably about 20% of releases. It's going to depend on the project and whether they made releases before or not. And most common the reasons is that there's unexpected compiled code in the release, or you've got compiled code that has an incompatible license, GPL for instance. Another common issue is with IP issues. I've on a couple of occasions sadly had to vote -1 on a release because it included a picture of a cat that was just copied off the internet. And we can't take a professional photographer's photograph and include it in a release without their permission. So that's something you've got to be careful of. The other one is that you might have a large number of files that are missing ASF headers. That rarely happens these days, but has happened occasionally. So these are sort of the main one why you might get a -1 vote. But if you've got good mentors and you get them to review your releases, then everything should be fine when it comes to the incubator vote. And you're not expected to get this right the first time. Practice makes perfect. Involve your mentors in the release process. Listen to what they say. Use the alternate disclaimer if you need, particularly if licensing is complex. Then you might want to do that for the first couple of releases. ASF policy has evolved over time, and they are just a set of guidelines. So they may not be clear or may not apply to your exact situation. Sometimes it can be difficult to determine that. Ask questions of your mentors to try and get this resolved, or ask the incubator about this. And probably the best advice I could give is make lots of releases. Do it, release often. If you release often, then there's only small incremental changes between the releases. It makes them a lot easier to review because less has changed. If you make a release that's 6 months or a year apart, then the chances are there's a lot of change, and there's likely that there will be an issue there. And just try and aim for making each release better than the last. It doesn't have to be perfect. So by this time, you've bootstrapped the project, you've made a few releases, you're starting to see interest in the project, you want to try and raise the project's profile. And this may involve people who you don't have in your project. You need people who can improve the website, who can talk at conferences, who can write blog articles, who are good at social media. You want all those sort of things. Now, it may be you're lucky and you have someone already involved in the project that can do that. But this is where you see that you want to try and attract a diverse set of users that have different backgrounds and skills who can all contribute to your project in meaningful ways that is not just writing code. The other thing you need to work out while you've sort of got to this stage is how you add committers and PMC members. You need to work out where the bar is and what does someone have to do to become a committer. I often see projects set that bar far too high, and it ends up that only full-time people who are paid to work on the project could ever become committers, and that excludes a large portion of people who could make useful contributions to your project. If someone comes along to your project and makes a few good contributions, and if they're not encouraged or rewarded for those contributions, they may go away and find another project to work with. So my advice to projects is try and set that bar as low as you possibly can to add new contributors and committers all the time to your project. So finally, you've grown the community, you've made releases, It's getting time to when you're going to graduate. Now, your mentors will generally contact you and suggest that it's time to graduate. And there's a few tools and checklists that we have that we can work out roughly if you're ready or not. But in short, you're ready to graduate when you can operate independently, when you can self-govern, when you don't need the incubator to hold your hand anymore. There's a few things that the incubator also wants to see, and that is that you understand releases, that you understand ASF branding and trademarks, and that you're not controlled by a single entity or group. You need that diversity in your contributor base and in your committers and in your PMC if you want to become a top-level project. The process for becoming a top-level project is usually pretty straightforward. There's a discussion on the incubator general list, and the incubator PMC will vote on it. It may be that they find a few minor issues that need correcting. It may, hopefully, but this has happened a couple of times, there may be some major issues there, and it may take a few months before you can start that discussion again. Once the vote has passed, and you then put a proposal for the board, and the board generally approves all proposals that it receives. So congratulations, you're now a top-level project. So thanks for coming on and listening to my talk on the Apache Way and how you can learn the Apache Way by going through the Apache Incubator. If you have any questions at all, please get in touch and I'll be happy to answer them.